We are on the frontiers of a new science. We're all starting to awaken to truths about who we are and where we're going. Open yourself to new knowledge about the power of spiritual energy and consciousness. Journey with Donna Smith-Moncrieffe as she takes you through the world of mediumship, energy healing, out-of-body experiences, past life regression, and all topics that demonstrate evidence of the true nature of our reality.
Welcome to On the Frontiers of a New Science. I am Donna Smith-Moncrieffe, and on today's show we are going to examine a rare form of mediumship that, when facilitated by an authentic physical medium, can contribute to knowledge about the spirit world, greater understanding of the nature of reality, and reunions between the living and the departed. Before I introduce our guest, let's examine some key facts about physical mediumship. Fact number 1. Sir William Crookes, a top scientist in the 20th century, was lauded for his pioneering work with thallium and cathode rays. Cathode rays being the key ingredient that brought the possibility of television. He replicated experiments with physical mediums, Daniel Douglas Hume and Florence Cook. He was able to substantiate the evidence that Florence Cook could materialize an entity from the spirit world known as Katie King. He used this scientific method to demonstrate that our memories, thoughts, personality, and soul survives the death of the physical body. Fact number 2. Ectoplasm has been scientifically studied for over 100 years. Professor Charles Richet, who was awarded a Nobel Prize for chemistry, studied it for 30 years. He found that in its primary stage, it is invisible and intangible, but it can be weighed. In its secondary stage, it becomes either vaporous or liquid or solid, with a smell somewhat akin to ozone. He wrote, "There is ample proof that experimental materialization should take a definite rank as a scientific fact. Assuredly, we do not understand it. It is very absurd if a truth can be observed." Baron von Notzig, a Munich physician, showed that ectoplasm is composed of leukocytes, white or colorless blood cells, and epithelial cells, those taken from the various protective tissues of the body. Ectoplasm will be an important part or a concept for you to note as we have our discussion with our guest. Fact number 3. Sir Oliver Lodge, the first man to send a radio signal in 1894, made it clear that the ether is the spiritual part of the universe, the place where we come from and return to after our stay on Earth. The ether is the missing part of the universe that all scientists are now trying to account for in their mathematical equations. Keeping some of these key facts in mind, we have the pleasure of speaking with Reverend Tom Newman, former senior pastor at the Sarasota Center of Light Church. Tom grew up in a family that regularly participated in physical mediumship séances and has been privileged to observe and play the role of circle leader with a number of physical mediums around the world. So with no further ado, welcome, Tom, to On the Frontiers of a New Science. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderfully, Donna. Thank you for asking.
Oh, that's great. So I'm looking forward to talking to you, Tom. We know that you're very experienced, quite an expert in physical mediumship. And although we've discussed physical mediumship on this show before, just before we get into following up on some of your more recent experiences, could you just tell us some of the basics? What is physical mediumship?
Well, mediumship, there are basically two types of mediumship. One is mental mediumship, which is the more prevalent, the more common form, and that's where a medium is getting information from people in the spirit realm, mostly spirit guides, and then conveying that information. With physical mediumship, it is an experience where spirit is working with the medium, and the result can be sensed by the human's 5 senses, some of their 5 senses, whether it's sight or sound or touch. And the physical mediumship is much more rare. You'll find some forms of physical mediumship that people may be familiar with would be deep trance. Some of the more rare ones are trumpet mediumship, and then you have materialization, and you have precipitated paintings, and also precipitated cards. And one other form of levitation is a form. That's D.D. Hume was quite famous for that. And the last one that I can think of is apports, or objects being dematerialized and rematerialized.
Right.
So it's something that can be sensed through the five senses.
Right. So, and it's good that you sort of laid the foundation for the listeners in that there's mental and physical. Have you noticed, though, sometimes, though, the two seem to interact, like in a physical mediumship séance, there can be, at times, information that is coming through directly, I don't know, through the sitters, or do you think that there can be interaction during a physical mediumship séance with mental mediumship?
There can be. I pretty much have felt that physical mediumship is a purer form of communication with the spirit world, because in most, when you're working mentally, spirit is still having to work with the medium's their own mind, which can be a filter at times. But a lot of the physical mediumship, especially when the medium is in deep trance, you're getting a purer form of communication.
Right. No, and I think that's a very good point to make, because and when we get into later talking about the reunions and sitters, I think that sometimes even the critics have said, well, when the entities come through, they're not as specific sometimes as what we're kind of getting in mental mediumship. So it's interesting to note that it is a purer form. There's direct voice, there's direct communication, but as we'll talk about later, because of some of the limitations with ectoplasm and sometimes the challenge with the sitters sometimes using the ectoplasm to speak, perhaps sometimes it's not as strong as an entity who's as more experienced. And as we talk about ectoplasm, which that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start us off with some basic facts that this exists. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is? Have you had any experiences seeing ectoplasm?
Oh, sure. Ectoplasm is created by the pancreas, and it is part of the medium's life force. I have seen it, I think, 4 or 5 times with 2 different materialization mediums. It cannot tolerate white light. Ectoplasm with white light is similar to hot boiling water being poured on snow. Those 2 conditions really can't exist together at the same time. However, there have been materialization mediums that have worked with a red light. And under the right circumstances, a red light will allow you to see what's going on. The challenge with the red light certainly is that it takes a physical toll on the medium, and that the experience, the séance, generally won't last as long. But basically, it looks like white gauze. And one time with David, actually my very first materialization session with David Thompson was in England in 2007. And William, who was David's primary teacher, talked to the circle leader and said, okay, you can turn on the red light. And then he had the circle leader and another representative of his team, his circle, pull the curtain back, and you could see the ectoplasm coming from David's mouth and nose. Now, he's got a gag in his mouth, so it comes, past the gag, going down his chest and pulling up in the floor. And then I've seen that with David a couple of times, and Kai Muga, a German materialization medium, I sat with him last January, and they did some pretty dramatic things with the ectoplasm. But you need to remember, as they pull it from the medium and they step into it, it coats their etheric body with a thin film, and they essentially take on physical form. And no matter where they walk in the room, one end of that ectoplasm is still inside the medium's body. And that's why you have to be so careful not to actually, accidentally touch it, because it will cause a rupture and it will coil back into the medium's body very quickly. And the potential is to do damage to internal organs because it moves back so quickly. And I think most people, well, I shouldn't say that. I think some people have ectoplasm, that's in their body. The folks that are successful as materialization mediums or trumpet mediums, they have a lot of ectoplasm.
They have a lot of it.
Right. A lot of it created.
And, I mean, again, for our listeners, again, this has been the scientists have studied ectoplasm, so we know it exists. I've seen it as well in a few physical mediumship séances, and you've described it very carefully. And I think what's interesting to note, and it's funny that you'd mentioned, especially the example that you gave when you said in one of the earlier physical mediumship séances you had with David Thompson in England, I think you said 2007. It's interesting that William allowed you to use the red light to see the ectoplasm, and I think some of the questions we get, sort of, and even from non-skeptical questions, is why aren't we allowed to see that at every particular séance? I want to tell you what I'm thinking, and then perhaps you can share your perspective. One of the things I strongly believe is that the different energies in the room with the different sitters have a big impact on what William or his team feel that they can do, the differences in energy. And I'm wondering if, in particular, that you were able to draw the curtain, use the red light, and actually see David Thompson there in trance with the gag and all the ectoplasm coming out. Could you tell us maybe about that context? Were they more comfortable with the sitters there? Was the energy more stable that night? Can you give us some more context about why that particular experience? Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. I was a participant at that séance. I was not part of his team at that time.
Okay.
But I was sitting in like the second chair. I was next to one of his team from Australia at the time. And I think you're right. I think basically what allows you to see it and for them to show it to you and or not to show it to you, a lot of it has to do with the energy in the room. That's created by the participants. This was a church in Newton Abbot, which is in southern England, and so most of the participants were familiar to each other. And I think that had a lot to do with creating the right vibration. One thing to keep in mind, and David's team, David's spirit team, they're highly intelligent. They're very evolved beings. And there are things that they're doing with his mediumship. I can see steps of progress every year, but they don't want to take a toll on his physical body by working with the red light on a regular basis. Jack Weber is a good example. He was an English materialization medium from last century, and he demonstrated a lot with the red light, and he ended up making his transition, I think, at the age of 34. And so what?
And can you elaborate on that a bit, Tom? Because we know Kai Mugi, for example, works in red light all the time. So has anyone from the spirit world or the spirit team explained this a bit more to you? Like, what is it about red light that, although obviously you've said white light, it just doesn't work. What is it about red light and the impact that it has on diminishing the physical medium's ability to prolong their demonstrations for a long time? Has anyone explained that to you?
Well, I think basically what you're looking at, the ectoplasm is primarily, and everything within the body is, has a purpose, as you know. But the ectoplasm primarily is in a light-free environment inside the body. There's no light, touching it or getting close to it. Somehow they determined that a red light, the ectoplasm could be used in a red light. Now, again, it has its toll, and I have heard I have heard from another friend who's attended a lot of Kai's seances that his guides have said that the time that he will be able to demonstrate will be limited, in a physical way. His longevity as far as being a materialization medium will be limited. Now, this is what I've heard. Don't take that as gospel because I can't prove it. But basically, and in the seances that I've sat with him twice, in those seances, they would turn the red light on for a few minutes to do something, and then they would turn it off. And it was kind of on and off, such as that. Now you had Ethel Post Parrish, who was a very famous materialization medium, and several others in the last century that would work more frequently with the red light. But it does take its toll. I think it's because the ectoplasm is normally not exposed to light, and light has a diminishing effect on how long they can use it. I think that's pretty much the key.
Right.
It has a diminishing effect. So what do you do?
Yeah. No, and this, Mm-hmm.
Well, I found that the one thing in the seances I've sat in, I think I've sat with David 35 times, 36 times.
Okay.
And I also sat, the founder of my church, Dorothy Flexer, was a materialization. Well, she was a trumpet medium.
Right.
She could do materialization, but she chose to work with the trumpet. And I've sat in over 3,000 of those seances. But the thing is, the room that you're working in is so small. Generally it's pretty intimate. You can hear anything that takes place. So you're not going into this experience of materialization or any type of physical phenomena blindly and just having to have total faith in the whole process. You can hear, your senses are heightened, in the dark because you can't see. But you can hear them walking around in the room when they've taken on physical form. They're speaking with their own vocal cords. It's their thoughts coming just from their materialized being. Those thoughts are not going through the medium's head. Mediums in deep trance, they're coming directly from the spirit person. So that's why I mentioned earlier that I feel that physical phenomena, generally, you're getting a pure connection. It's not consciously going through the medium's brain and their thoughts and all of that.
That's
but
right.
It's fascinating about... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, to reiterate for our listeners, that's a really important point that you're making, is that the ectoplasm by itself, it's just an inanimate object, but it's when the thoughts from the spirit team or those, the discarnates or the entities now materializing, that's what brings that's what brings the whole physical manifestation. It's not just that the ectoplasm itself is the magic trick, right? There's more to it. Yes.
The ectoplasm is the car, but you've got to have someone that has the intelligence to know how to work the car.
Exactly. Now, in particular, one of the things that I wanted to do on this particular show, because of course we could still talk about your other experiences outside of it, I think where it's appropriate. But I know David Thompson. Let's talk about him in particular, some of the more recent physical mediumship seances you were part of. One of the things I want to help our listeners know about, and I began to learn about as I began to study physical mediumship a little more, is that the rare form, I think, that David Thompson brings to the table here is that he's able to materialize entities who are able to have reunions with the sitters in the room. And so, for example, some of the other physical mediums that are more prevalent seem to use the ectoplasm either for apports, they can move the trumpet, there's partial materializations, like if, for example, Kai Mugi's seance, I saw the hand come up, things like that. But one of the things that I want to talk about is the whole issue of survival of consciousness, this sort of aspect that if your loved one can materialize into a seance through a physical medium, that's what really got me excited about physical mediumship. So I wondered if we could go back. I think you've had, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you recently had a number of different, almost like a tour with David Thompson, I think maybe in Santa Fe, some in Arizona, and some now in Sarasota. Let's look back at those a bit And can we talk about stories about reunions, any new discoveries, challenges? Let's do that, because I think that's the exciting part for our listeners. And I'll let you tell me in your particular order about this, what your experiences were. Yeah.
Well, in Santa Fe, in each of those three cities, David and his team did 3 materialization seances. The very first night in Santa Fe, there was, we had 35 people there, and there was a African-American gentleman who I'd say was probably in his early 40s, and Abraham Lincoln materialized. Now, I'm going to take you somewhere with this.
Right.
He walked over to this man, and he said, I want you to know, the man introduced himself, and he said, I want you to know that you are just as worthy as anybody else on the earth for any experiences that can be had. He said, when you walk into a room, you hold your head up high. He said, because you are an ambassador of spirit. He said, there will be a time down the road that you will be an instrument where your counseling through mediumship will be able to help many, many people. And he said, I will be a personal guide to you. And, of course, this was very dramatic, especially, for this gentleman. They had another lady, Timmy, who's one of David's guides. He manifests as a young child around nine.
Yes.
And he said, there's someone here who lost a child. And one lady said, well, I lost a child through miscarriage. And he said, well, did you know that child was a boy? And she said, no. And she said, he's here. Would you like to meet him?
Wow.
And
yes.
So he materialized, and he walked over. He and Timmy walked over to where she was sitting, and he put his hand on top of her hand. Now, as you know, in a materialization seance with David and with several others, everyone holds hands, so no one accidentally reaches out, and touches the ectoplasm or touches a materialized being, because it can be quite detrimental. Right. But this was very, very moving for her. We had another situation. We had a situation in Santa Fe also. There was a woman there who was 83 years old. She was blind, and this was a new experience for her. I mean, any type of mediumship was new for her. And she'd come there with a neighbor of mine who'd been to several of David's seances. And her father came in and spoke to her. And, he talked to her and gave her encouragement. And then another woman had asked a question about why so many people in her life had made their transition. She's 50, and she'd had at least 10 people that had made the transition. Then her father came in and spoke, and he talked about, I think he transitioned about 2 years ago. One of the most dramatic ones we had was in Sarasota when you were there last year.
Oh, yes.
There was a group. I have a group of people that I work with classes and things of that nature, and we had 12 people that were all committed to coming to Sarasota to experience David's work. And one lady, her name was Anne, she was planning and very excited, and she had a very close friend that the two of them were going to go. And then 8 days before we depart, Anne makes her transition unexpectedly. Well, her friend...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, her friend, was torn about whether to go or not. She was very upset, but then she just felt that it was the right thing to go. Anne materialized in the first seance, that this lady was in, and came over to her and whispered to her. As you can imagine, most spirit people don't have any experience at all with ectoplasm, so they're listening to the team telling them how to work with it and speak through it and all of that. But she said to her, "I'm always with you," and she touched her on the face and in a way that was quite evidential of the way she had done it before. But going back to this, go ahead.
Yeah. Let me just interject with that for a minute. Is one of the things that I followed up with her and asked her what was evidential about it is she had a very slender hand. Mm-hmm. Her friend, and she was able to feel that on her face. And I think just to help our listeners understand, to help, because some of them, some people listening to this don't understand. For example, it's in the darkness sometimes unless the luminous plaque is used. And how is it that people struggle to understand how is this evidential? Because sometimes the voices don't sound exactly like their loved ones because of either the muffling of the ectoplasm or the inability of the materialized entity to remember exactly how they sounded. But I think one of the points I'd like our listeners to understand is that there are different things for the different sitters that make it evidential. It's not just one thing that's evidential. It could be they've said something that no one else could know. Let's just go back, for example, to the one where you talked about the sun materializing. Mm-hmm. Would anybody have known Would anybody have known, for example, that particular lady had a miscarriage? Because those are things that usually people don't know. Not every woman has a miscarriage.
Yeah, no one. No one knew it, and she was actually hesitant to say anything. Timmy had to ask a couple of times about it, and then she finally said, right. "Well, I had this," as you commented so eloquently, it's not a matter of did they sound like they used to. I mean that question is so far, off base of what's really happening. Where you get the evidence is, there was a gentleman in Scottsdale. His father came in. Right. And he said, he was talking about the man's sister who was in spirit. And he mentioned them, your sister blank is here. She sends her greetings to you. And then he made reference to his wife's name, who was the man's mother. She was still living, but having some physical difficulties. They were doing that, which was quite evidential. And I can assure you, David, some people will think, well, he does research on the people in the room. He doesn't know who's going to be there. And David's right. A man of integrity, and so is David's team from the spirit world. I think one of the most dramatic experiences was in Sarasota a few years ago, and I will use this lady's first name. Her name is Virginia, and this was back in 2010, and I think William was answering a question of hers, and he said, "By the way, there will be somebody who will come in to speak with you," and she was thrilled. She was 82 at the time. And a little bit later, when the loved ones were coming in, this man materialized. He walked over and he said, "Virginia," and we put a piece of 4x8 plywood in the center of the room in the chapel in Sarasota, so you can hear them when they're walking on it. And he walks across that to where she was. I was just 2 chairs away from her, and he walks up and he says, "Virginia, do you know who this is?" And I knew that her husband, whose name was Ted, had died about 5 years earlier. And I'm thinking, well, it's going to be Ted. He said, right. She said, no. She said, yes, I do. It's Gene. And I was wondering, wow, I wonder where this is going. Well, Gene was her husband of 52 years ago. And I'd known Virginia for 20 years. I never knew she had a first husband who died in his 20s. And so they talked back and forth about things in their lives, what they did in their days of courtship, and then you hear 3, it sounds like 3 kisses, and then he's gone. And so afterward there was a reception, and I came up to her and was talking about how great it was that she had a communication, and I said, I didn't know you were married. She said, yes. And he was much taller than I was. And whenever he would leave for work, he would kiss me 3 times on the top of the head because we had 3 children.
Oh.
I mean, that type of evidence, there's no way possible anybody would know that.
Yes.
So it was.
Join us each week as Donna Smith-Moncrieffe explores topics related to spiritual energy and consciousness. Collaborating with other experts, they will share evidence and ideas for you to integrate consciousness-based ideas into your life for a positive transformation.